Hi, welcome to Grafted Jewish Roots of Christianity. My name is Stephanie Pavlantos, and today my guest is Ryan White. So if I read his bio to you, we would be on here for an hour just reading that. This man's done a great deal of different things. And so let me just give you a little bit of a background. He started out in the Navy as a nuclear engineer and then became a nurse, worked in the ICU. And then I believe that he transitioned into more manager for a large hospital system. He went into ministry. I believe you're still a nurse, but you go into ministry on your spare time, I guess. He's the voice and vision behind Faith of Messiah. He's also one of the founders of the Saturday Church Community, which I will allow him to share more about that. He has his master's in the biblical studies with the focus on the Old Testament. He has a great website, and we'll share more about that later, but lots of videos, lots of information, lots and lots of things to help you grow in your faith, as well as understand the Bible better. So thank you for being here today, Ryan. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a real big honor.
Well, thanks. So would you like to share a little bit more about yourself? Because I know I just gave the highlights and you have much more to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, like you said, I've kind of transitioned careers on my more professional side. I'm currently it's kind of almost an IT nursing role that
Hmm.
I'm managing over, so that's been really great. But I mean, my passion has really been the ministry, Faith of Messiah. I started off with a kind of a different name, but transitioned many years ago back over to Faith of Messiah. And my passion really has been studying the Bible from an ancient Near Eastern cultural context. It's, when you get to those verses that sometimes you just kind of glaze over, and you're like, I don't know what that means, I'm not gonna, like, I love that. I like to dig in and say, like, why in the world did they do this? Why does the Bible care to record this weird detail
Right.
in there? And what I've found is that we actually have a really great ability to go in and understand the cultures from back then. But the problem is it's all, kind of hidden away, if you will, in books that most people would fall asleep reading the first couple of pages. I mean, a lot of the books I read, there's more than half the pages just footnotes
Right.
quoting other people. And so what I love to do is just try to understand the function, the thing behind the thing, like why are they doing this? And then being able to not only just explain that, but also connect that to modern life. There's so much stuff in the Bible that, oftentimes it's almost like you have two extremes. It's either, well, we're going to do it and we don't know why we're going to do it, and we're just going to do it and look kind of goofy doing it. Or, well, that was back then and we just ignore that part of the Bible. And what I like to do is just say, what about a third option? What if actually we don't need to, like, do it for no reason, but maybe there's a different way of doing it. Maybe there's a way of bringing it forward, bringing these connections into our life today. And I mean, I found so many things in scripture that just, it comes alive when you try to put yourself in the mindset and then make those connections to how we still do those things, same things today. We still have those same struggles today. They're just in a different platform, but it's the same thing. We're all humans. We're all struggling with these same issues,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. And it is true. I mean, and I don't think that we hear a lot of that ancient Near East, in that perspective in most of our churches. We kind of have taken the Bible and made it an American book that we look through with Western eyes and say, this is what it means. And when I read somewhere and learned somewhere that when Jesus talked about food, when Paul talked about food, there was a word that they used that actually meant biblically clean food, not food, but we look at it like food, as in what we think of food. But if we don't look at the audience that was spoken to and the time and the culture and history of everything, then we kind of get off track of what the true meaning is and what the message is behind that meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you just going on food. If I said, we can eat, we're allowed to eat all things in America today. I bet you if we went and said that to most people, they wouldn't think that now dog and cat are on the menu.
Right. Right. And I've actually used that example before because I think, if you go to China, go to, I don't know, Vietnam, I mean, what they
Yeah.
might eat, you would like, this is not food, but they're like, yes, it is food, so there's that whole thing. But yeah, so I think that we can't just look at food. We can't just look at law. There's certain words we can't just look at and think of American meaning of that word because there's I think Hebrew has 5 different words for law. So we have to take in consideration those Hebrew meanings and such. And we have a lot of misconceptions about the feasts as well. I actually said this on another podcast, but we tend to think that they're the Jewish feasts, but they're actually the Lord's feasts.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we look at it through that lens, but I think sometimes we get into these debates whether or not we should keep them, and it's like humans have a natural desire to celebrate, right?
Mhm.
These the feast dates as they're given, this wasn't like Israel was a group of people who never had any celebrations and they were just dull and miserable, and all of a sudden God came along and said, hey, I want you to start actually having a little bit of fun a couple times a year. No,
Mhm.
they people naturally celebrated at the harvest
Right.
times, right? And that's the feasts are very heavily connected with the harvests, and
Mhm.
so it's a natural time for people to celebrate. And God is not only saying, hey, during these times, remember me and celebrate. Let's celebrate, not
Mhm.
just celebrate him, but it's celebrating human connection with him,
Mhm.
right? It's about us together, not just about him. Um, but it's also just this subtle message of, great, I want you to celebrate, but remember I'm there with you. And so you've got to make your celebrations a sacred time. There's so many times where we we forget that God's there with us, right? We think, oh well, He's only here with us on Saturdays or Sundays or whatever the case may be, and then the other days of the week we forget that He's still there with us, and we don't act as those image bearers that we're called to be. And to me, that's one of those strong messages of the feasts is, even in the times where you're celebrating to an extent that you may get caught up in it,
Mhm.
you got to remember that he's there with us, and we've got to have that sacredness to those occasions too.
Yes, absolutely. And I know that we're not a real agricultural culture anymore. We don't, I mean, maybe in some parts of the United States they're out putting gardens in and taking care of animals and whatnot. We personally do have a garden and animals. And I know that when we got goats, the first time we had a new baby goat born, it was really emotional actually, because it was like, look at this life that the Lord has allowed us to be part of. It's like it came, it was born here in our barn, and this is life, and that is really growing, is going to be part of our flock, of our herd, I should say. And the same with our ducks and our chickens and even our garden. My husband, when he brings in basketful of tomatoes or basketful of fruits and vegetables, he's just like, look what the Lord has given us. And I think that's what it goes back to, having that mindset of how he has blessed us. And but we
Yeah,
don't really, we're not there all the time. Or
yeah. That I mean, that reminds me, one of my weirdly favorite book of the Bible, the book of Leviticus.
Mhm.
And most people, when they think about it, they just say, oh, that's disgusting, animal slaughter, animal sacrifices, I'm just going to eat my cheeseburger and forget that the book of Leviticus exists.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
And the reality though is that, I mean, outside of vegans or vegetarians, right, we all eat meat, and that
Right.
has to be killed somehow. What we've done is we've disconnected ourselves from that slaughter of that
Absolutely.
animal. And in the ancient culture, they, just like you're talking about, they see life and it's sacred and it's valuable. And so of course, if you're going, to slaughter something to eat it, because that's what the majority of the sacrifices were for, was so that you could eat them.
Right.
What they're saying is, treat this life as sacred, right? Give it meaning, give it purpose. So it's not some disgusting ritual. It was, when you want to have a cheeseburger, great, but treat this life as sacred.
Mm-hmm.
Bring God into this act, and show this respect for life that we've really lost as a culture.
Yeah, I agree. I agree because the first time we took an animal, now we weren't prepared to slaughter our first goat ourselves, but we did take it somewhere. But my husband, before we left it with them, he prayed over that animal. I mean, it gets me emotional now because it's like I just remember him putting both hands on its head and just praying and saying, "Thank you, Lord, for this animal that we're gonna have meat from and to put in our freezer." But yeah, we're far away from the sacrifice of an animal so we can eat. We don't have to do that. And
Yeah.
but I actually wrote about that in a Bible study I had written. Actually just talked about what you just mentioned, because it was like, to me, we're so far removed. And then even when you go into, public, well, just like when Jesus died on the cross, I mean, that was very public and people don't realize the blood that's involved. And we're not used to seeing that kind of thing, public executions and whatnot. We're so far removed that we're insensitive to the blood that's shed so that we can eat, so that we can live, so that we actually, so even for our salvation, we become just insensitive to it. So
Yeah, I mean, that has such a deep impact, because we don't understand, we don't appreciate, should I say, the sacrifice that goes into everything that we have. I mean, even I forget what it was, I think it was the Suez Canal. Something like 100,000 people died when they were digging that.
wow.
And I mean, you think we miss it, we gloss over the pain and the suffering and the misery
Hmm.
that has existed. And it's not that we need to dwell on it, day and night nonstop, but there has to be an acknowledgement, and it has to be making that life sacred
Hmm.
at some level, and just thanking God for his provision, and his leading us, or putting us in a place where we're not being slave labor forced to dig the
Right.
Suez Canal.
Right. Yeah, we're so blessed that we take it all for granted these
Hmm.
days. Yeah, so I get that. And I think that's even one thing that we've tried to instill in our children, just like, do you realize what goes into butchering things, and even keeping a garden, from the weeds just taking over, the work that's all involved, and the fact that anything grows at all sometimes, with our crazy weather. So yeah, I mean, we're just too far removed. But anyway, we wanted to talk about Passover since we're talking about the feast. I wanted to talk about Passover as well, and that kind of goes with that thing, whole whole topic of what we're talking about, because there were a lot of lambs being sacrificed before Passover, for
Yeah.
Passover, and just the sheer numbers that I have heard are just amazing. But go ahead, and where do you think we should start there? Should we start? Where do you
I
start when you talk about
I
Passover?
actually I like to start, back it up a little bit, and look at the what starts the this whole thing, right? We've got Israel comes down to Egypt.
Right.
We've got Joseph, who, while he does save his family and brings them
Mhm.
to Goshen, we see kind of the cracks start to break, or the what's the foreshadowing of what's about to come, should I say, where Joseph ends up enslaving the Egyptian people as they're running out of food. They sell all their livestock, and they sell their land, and then they end up selling themselves into slavery. And that's how the book of Genesis ends. And then you
Mm.
get to the book of Exodus, and there's this inversion. All of a sudden, it's Israel who's become enslaved. And what I found just absolutely fascinating, though, is when you really look at it and you read between the lines, Israel's not, I mean, Israel is physically enslaved, but it's actually the entire land of Egypt that is enslaved to a system of oppression.
Mm.
Pharaoh, well, yes, Pharaoh is at the top, and by no means am I saying that, he was, you know, oh, it was okay what he was doing, but the reality is that Pharaoh himself was just as much a slave to his own system. He
Right.
lived in constant anxiety, this idea that we can't even let people have one day off
Mhm.
or 3 days off once a year to worship God, that if we were to allow people to stop working even for a day, that the entire system would collapse. And he's got Israelites slaving away to build up a store city because he's got so much wealth that now he needs to build another city to store his wealth.
Right.
And so this entirety of this narrative starts with this anxiety over production. It's a 24/7 economy, which to me kind of
Mm.
rings true to what we live in today. I mean,
Yes.
you think about it, I mean, I just saw it like a week or so ago, that something in the news that there was this one Chick-fil-A that they're trying to shut down. And now it's a special situation. It's at a rest stop or something like that
Right.
that's
I've heard
publicly
that.
owned. But they wanted to shut it down because it's not open one day of the week.
Hmm.
And to me, that just it opens my eyes that we're very much in a very similar situation. We are enslaved to an economic system that has no end. There's no way to satiate the system. I mean, Apple, $3 trillion company, Microsoft, $3 trillion company. How much is enough?
Right.
It's
We're all
it's
building
never enough.
kingdoms. It's like you're all built, everyone's building their own kingdom. And yeah,
Yeah.
and that's it. That's what it boils down to, I guess.
And to me, I feel like a lot of that comes from anxiety. This idea that if we're not moving upwards, then we're failing, that the system's going to collapse.
Uh-huh.
And yet here at this ancient book of Exodus, and actually if you back it all the way up to Genesis, you've got this just astounding story that any of the other cultures reading the book of Genesis would have been had their minds blown, because here you have this God who takes a day off.
Yeah.
Like, they were all built around this idea of productivity, and here's this God who just takes a day off. On the seventh day he rests.
Mm-hmm.
And that's our very first feast that's mentioned in the Bible, is the
Right.
Sabbath. And that was truly revolutionary in a world that they didn't have that concept. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, if you move forward to the first century, this is really interesting to me. In Greek, in your Greek New Testament, the word for week, the word for week is the word sabbaton.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why it's sabbaton, which you might recognize
Mm-hmm.
as similar to Sabbath, it was borrowed from the Hebrew because the Greeks did not have the concept of a week. They had no 7 day cyclical week. They had a month, and you might get a day off when you were celebrating some god, but they didn't have a 6 day work week. They didn't have a 7 day work week. They worked nonstop.
Yeah.
And so here you have a Genesis 1 opens up with a God who takes a day off. You have Exodus, where you have again the system of oppression that wants to just continue working. And they won't, like, Pharaoh is so insane, he won't even let people take a 3 day journey to worship their gods, or to
Right.
their worship their God, should I say, God singular.
In this case, yes.
um, but that just shows, I mean, like, that was abnormal in the ancient world. They would normally allow their slaves to go off and worship their god for a short amount of time, but Pharaoh has so much anxiety, he's still enslaved to the system.
Mm-hmm.
And so going forward, you have, of course, the 10 plagues, which I think most people are familiar with. These plagues were targeting the gods of Egypt.
Right.
Uh, Not necessarily 10 particular gods, but they were challenging the idea that there are that forces of nature are gods, that Pharaoh himself
Right.
is a god. They're challenging this not just for the Egyptian mindset, but the Israelites needed that to be mentally broken free
Mm-hmm.
of slavery as well. And we see this when they get into the wilderness, right?
Right. Right.
You turn around and they're off there worshiping a golden calf. They're complaining about this, that, or the other. Like
Yeah.
all of these things are going on. And so all of this builds up to this crescendo where on the 10th plague, Pharaoh's or the oldest child, the oldest male son in Egypt, God's going to go through and wipe all of them out.
Mm-hmm.
And so what God asked the Israelites to do is to sacrifice a lamb, put the blood on the doorpost, and then eat the meat of that lamb
Mm-hmm.
while it's there. Now, what's fascinating to me is, and you can see hints of this in the text, the Egyptians worship nature. And to them, there may not have been a particular lamb god, but they were very averse to the idea of animal sacrifices. You can see that, I think it's in Exodus 8, verse 20, somewhere in there, where Moses is like, hey, we need to go out in the wilderness to sacrifice. Otherwise, you're going to have a riot if we
Yes.
sacrifice in the town. And so part of this Passover ritual, this Passover sacrifice, was doing something public. Not only are you sacrificing this lamb, you're marking your door so that anyone who walks by can see, oh, that house, they are defying Pharaoh. They are
Mm-hmm.
defying us as Egyptians. They're doing something that we abhor. And when we look at it, the reality is that Israel wasn't that monotheistic to begin with in Egypt. I mean, they were, so it was in a sense almost saying, I want you to sacrifice the thing that you thought was a god. I want you to kill this thing off. It's part of this breaking of this mindset. And that's really to me what that Passover at its core was about. It was about freedom
Mm-hmm.
from Pharaoh, freedom from slavery in Egypt, and freedom from the mental bondage that this slavery put on the people. I think it's hard for us sometimes to grasp just how powerful that slavery mindset can be.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely agree because, even though, of course, there are slaves still today, there are situations in which we know going on around the world, but for the most part, not most of us could never imagine that. And even and I mean, and you hear different stories. So even during like the Civil War and after all of, before that, and we've gone through some areas down south in the Carolinas, these plantations, and just even hearing about what went on there. But I heard something that surprised me because they fed their slaves because they even knew that if they didn't feed them, they wouldn't get as much work out of them. And I think that we kind of our mindset goes back to what we think of as in Exodus, because it seemed like, when you see the pictures, when you see the Holocaust, you see these skeletons, these people who are just skin and bones, and you think, maybe that's what they went through in Exodus in during Pharaoh's time, that they were just walking skeletons. They didn't have any food, any way to feed themselves, and I don't know that that's true. I think that, you know
And I mean, I think that's a really good point to bring out. I don't think that that's true. I mean, you see, I mean, first off, if you don't feed them, you're right. How are they going to build a pyramid?
yeah.
You see them having the ability to, I mean, they have their own houses, they have their own essentially kind of tribal leadership, if you will.
Mhm. Yeah.
But within that, I mean, oftentimes enslaving people doesn't necessarily take chains. It doesn't take locking people up. It's about creating a mindset. It's
Right.
it's it's
Indoctrinated.
a world where it's an indoctrination, and all you have to do is devalue life,
Mhm.
right? And if you think about it, in Pharaoh's economy, who's the most valuable person? It's the 20-year-old male who's able to lift the biggest amount
Yes.
of weight. And
Mhm.
as you get older, your value decreases.
Mhm.
And and to the point where once you can't work, we don't really care if you live or die.
Right.
And that's a culture, and honestly, that's a culture and mindset that's creeping into at least the American mindset as well. You know,
Yes.
you look at companies, and now it's not no, it's no longer about physical strength, but companies now, they don't go out and hire the older people who have the wisdom. They want the younger people who have all of the crazy
Mhm.
ideas and the social
Mhm.
media influence and all of this stuff, and we're
Right.
losing our wisdom.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know,
Yeah, I
when
agree. I agree.
to not it doesn't matter what way you vote, but I just remember when Barack Obama was running, I heard people talking about wanting to vote for him because he was young and attractive.
Hmm.
And it just blew my mind. I don't remember who he was running against and whatever, but it just blew my mind that that became the qualifying factor for
Hmm.
the leader of the free world.
Right. Right.
You know, we've devalued wisdom, and we're starting to devalue life in the same way. I mean,
Yeah.
thankfully we still live in a culture that abhors slavery, that abhors murder and stuff like that.
Hmm.
But it doesn't take for that much to get there.
No.
And that's what Israel lived in. And it's a culture that devalued wisdom, the wisdom of the elderly. It devalued life in general. Life was cheap.
Mhm.
And when you look at the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and especially when I use that word Torah, I'm thinking about those commandments that we find later on in Exodus, and then throughout the rest of the 5 books of Moses. There's an overwhelming concern for life,
Mhm.
everything, including those ritual impurities. All of that has to do with life. For example, the leper. The
Mhm.
leper was someone who looked as if they were a corpse. They
Right.
looked like the walking dead, and that's why they were ritually impure, was because they were symbolic of death. And God is taking people out of a culture of death. If you think about it, right,
Yeah.
Egyptian culture is obsessed with death, the
Right.
afterlife, all of this stuff, and He's trying to just reshape their minds to away from this obsession with death and to value life above all else.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. And even in Leviticus, I remember having to teach on this once, but the high priest was not allowed to go around any death. And even if it was his own wife or a family member, I mean, God was very serious about that. You are not to be around death. And and I mean,
And
and
sometimes
it
that's hard for us to hear. We're like,
it
oh, well,
is.
how's that fair? I mean, you think
Mhm.
about, man, if my wife died or my father died or whatever, like
Mhm.
you couldn't stop me, right?
Right.
But because of that role in that position and that need to
Mhm.
separate out in that situation when they were coming out of a culture of death,
Mhm.
you have to, I mean, sometimes, it's like, I like to think of it sometimes as like a boot camp or as like a recovery, like alcohol recovery or something like that.
Uh-huh.
It's not necessarily that life is going to forever continue on that way, but sometimes you have to do shocking things
Mhm.
to break out of that enslavement to
Right.
a culture of death, to an addiction to alcohol, to
Mhm.
whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even now, I mean, my husband came out of addictions, and before we were married, thankfully, I mean, he 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 took off, God took him through all of those things before. But yeah, I mean, it comes from a Greek family. There was a lot of alcohol, a lot of drinking with meals, and he had to just say, no, I can't be around it. I can't do that. I don't want to do it. I don't want it in my, I don't want it at the table. So, I mean, so there were things that he had to separate himself totally from, even some celebrations, not that
Yeah.
it was, he had no control. He did, but he wasn't going to put himself in that situation again.
Well,
So,
and that's what control is to be
yeah.
to be able to control yourself enough to remove yourself from a situation, I think. I mean, yeah, I've dealt with stuff myself, and yeah, I mean, it's
Mhm. Mhm.
you it doesn't mean that everybody, like that no one should ever drink, but there
Right.
are certain people who just shouldn't and probably shouldn't even be around it. not because
Right.
they're weak, but because they're strong enough to admit
Right.
that they can't be around that.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how we all are when we come out of, like you said, we all have, we may not have certain addictions, but we're still in slavery. And that's what Galatians talk about. It's for freedom that he
Hmm.
set us free. And we still want to go back to a sinful lifestyle. We still want to go back, and we're no different than the children of Israel, because I remember hearing or reading that, when God took them out of Egypt, but then he had to take Egypt out of them. So,
Yeah, that
um,
was actually
oh,
my
sorry.
latest article I just wrote. I called it "Taking Egypt Out of Israel."
Okay. Oh, I think I did see that. Now that you say that, I think I did, but
Yeah, I'm definitely not the first to have that idea by any means,
no,
but yeah,
but
I mean, that to me, that's what the story, the
hmm
rest of the book of Exodus, and honestly, I mean, actually, the rest of the Bible
hmm
is still about taking Egypt out of us. I
right.
think that's, we get so focused on what things are sin and all of these things, and I have a little bit of a controversial viewpoint on this, and I'll state it out front. I am more, if you know about the atonement theories out there, I am very much in um, alignment with the Christus Victor model, meaning that the reason why Christ died on the cross was a victory over sin and death, rather than what's most evangelicals are raised in, which is the penal substitutionary atonement, which is this idea that
Mm.
sin makes God mad. God wants to kill us. Jesus died instead, and so God's no longer mad at us. And there's all sorts of different variations of that. But I've always struggled with that concept, and so I think that there is language about him dying for our sins to set us free. But I put that under that idea of, it's not that God just can't stand sin and wants to kill us. I mean, we throughout the Bible see him forgiving people without the
hmm
death of an animal or anything like that.
Right.
But it's something deeper and more powerful, that we have become enslaved to sin, and the only way to free us from that slavery was for him to come down and die and be resurrected. And that resurrection is so key. Paul talks about that. He said, if Messiah is not resurrected, you're still in your sins.
hmm
I think it's First Corinthians 15. He very clearly states it's not just the death, it's the death and the resurrection.
hmm
And when you have that forefront in your mind, to me, it's about what he did to set us free from that Pharaoh, which is the devil, which is slavery to death and to sin, and for us to come out on the other side and say, well, I'm set free now, I can do whatever I want. That's like, he just died to set you free from Pharaoh, and now you walk right back to Egypt.
Right. And Hebrews says you crucify him over and over in the
Yeah,
book of Hebrews. That's how he puts it. It's like, if you're not going to be free from it, you're doing nothing but crucifying him again, and it means nothing. And
yeah.
yeah, you're right. I think it's that hyper grace that we just go and keep asking for forgiveness, and it's never ending. And it isn't, in a certain regard, it isn't, but there's still a level of growth that we have to want to be free from our sins. We want to stop enjoying sin. I think that's what it gets down to,
Well,
really.
I mean, and that's the reality, and that's the wisdom of Scripture, is that when you're enslaved to sin, you think that's what brings you joy,
Hmm
and that's what Messiah died, was to break us from that. And yeah, I mean, I remember growing up, I used to think, I grew up in the Seventh Day Adventist church, which was
hmm
relatively strict, with the commandment keeping and stuff like that. And I used to think, man, it would be great to just live my life and do whatever I wanted and make a deathbed confession and still make it to heaven. Because in my mind as a teenager, that's what faith was all about. That's what forgiveness of sin was. It was just this: God has some arbitrary rules that if I jump through these hoops, he will send me up to heaven and I'll live forever. But really, they're making me kind of miserable.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I thought that it would be much better. So that's what I did. I when I left home, I left religion. I was agnostic and I did whatever I thought was fun.
Hmm.
And it turned out that's the road to misery.
Yeah. It
And I can tell you, I mean, just from personal experience, while it may seem fun in the moment, everything that is a sin brings misery and suffering in your own life and in other people's lives. And we have to find a way to let God put that wisdom in us. And I
Mhm.
believe that's what the scripture is it's putting wisdom in us to show us what we think is fun and what the Bible calls sin. It doesn't call sin because God just has a bunch of rules and he wants to see if if we're going to keep them or not. It's because those things lead to suffering and misery.
Mhm.
It's like that prodigal son. He went out and he did everything that he thought was fun, but it ended up living in a pigsty, essentially, wishing that he was a pig. He
Right.
he he it says that he wished he could eat the pods that the pigs ate, and those pods you couldn't eat them because humans can't digest that,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
so what Jesus is saying in that parable is he wished he was a pig. Here's a Jewish boy raised to believe that pigs are the most unclean, filthiest animals, and now he's so dehumanized he wished he could become a pig
Mhm.
rather than what he was. And
Yes.
that's what sin is. That's what sin leads us to. And that's what, when I look at the Passover, the old Passover, the one in Egypt, and I
Mhm.
look at what the Passover was in that Last Supper meal and Jesus as the Passover lamb on the cross, that's what I see as him setting us free from that slavery to that mindset,
Mhm.
along with, I mean, obviously there's a host of other things that are happening there, but when we look at that Passover aspect, it's about setting us free from this enslavement to the systems and the things that lead us to that death.
Mhm. Wow. Yeah. It's yeah. And I mean, and part of them bringing in, I guess, bringing the lamb in for 4 or 5 days, I guess it'd be more like 4, was part of bonding with that animal so then they could turn around and sacrifice it and eat it. I guess that's what I've always envisioned that what process was because he wanted them to, I mean, of course, they were supposed to test it, make sure it was pure, without
Yeah,
blemish and all of that, but man, I mean, whenever we've had to bring a lamb in, I remember going to a Torah class and people making comments about this whole sacrificial thing, and they're like, "Why does it even matter? Why would they even bring it in?" And just making comments because out of ignorance of not realizing, and I said, "Well, I speak into that just from somebody who owns sheep and goats, and when you're there and you're helping mama, pull that little lamb out or pour that little doling out, I mean, for me, I bond with that little bit. I mean, it's a new little life, and then to think about at some point in its life, now I'm gonna slit its throat and eat it. I said, that's hard. That's not.
it's
I
creating
don't.
that personal connection. It's
Mhm.
making it, that's one of the things that the word we often call it sacrifice, but the Hebrew word for it is korban, which means a gift.
Mhm.
It's something that's given to God it's drawing near. It's like when I give a gift to my wife, the reason isn't because she needs something. It's the whole purpose of gift giving is to create a relationship and strengthen that relationship.
Mhm.
And so when you think about sacrifices in that term of a gift given, a gift only has value if it's something that costs you. You
Right.
know, if
Right.
your husband went out and bought something for your birthday and gave it to you and afterwards said, "Hey, by the way, I got that for 90% off. What do you think?" Like 364 days of the year, if he bought something and got 90% off, you'd be ecstatic, right?
Yeah.
But that one day that he's giving it to you as a gift and he says, "By the way, I only paid $5 for that. Aren't you so proud of me?"
Mhm.
Suddenly 180 degrees
Right.
difference,
Oh,
because
yeah.
it had nothing to do with the value of the item itself. It had to do with what it cost you. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, bringing that lamb in and having that connection, it makes it a costly gift. You're not just randomly pulling in an animal. You're bringing in something that you've started to create a bond with,
Mhm.
and now you're giving that over to God.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah.
I was talking with someone from my church, but we were talking about the whole thing with worship. And he goes, if you follow the word worship back to the first time it was used when Abraham had to sacrifice his son Isaac. And he said, go to this mountain and worship me, and I'll tell you what to do, And it's like worship requires sacrifice. To truly worship, it requires sacrifice. And it may not be an animal in our lives, but it can definitely be giving up something, giving up, sacrificing, but maybe a job. I mean, maybe it's sacrificing something that you would love to buy for your family, but God's saying, no, I want you to use the money in this area to help a family in need. You're making a sacrifice of that hurts. That's got to be, it's you're getting rid of something that you really, really wanted or really, really loved. So,
Yeah. And I would add in with that too that your sacrifice has to serve a purpose too.
yeah.
It's like it's one thing if I jumped in a river and died trying to save a kid that was drowning, right?
Mhm.
It'd be a whole nother thing if I was walking along the banks of a river with a kid and then jumped in and just drowned myself for no
Right.
reason. And so I like to hold the two of those like in balance. Yes, it is. It has to be something that's costly. It has to be something that is important to you that you're giving over. And
Mhm.
that word sacrifice, connecting to kind of what we were talking about earlier, the word sacrifice comes from the Latin word sacrificum, which means to make sacred. Like that
Mm.
whole idea of sacrifice. Sacrifice doesn't mean to kill something. It means to make something sacred. So you have this
Wow.
idea of a gift given and it being sacred and having to be costly. And yes, we see it's connected with life, but that's because life is sacred and that's the most costly thing that you can give. I mean, if God just showed up and said, "Hey guys, you're forgiven,"
Right.
right? That doesn't cost anything, and
Right.
so that doesn't have that same impact. And you think about it, all the arguments about why Jesus has died over the millennia, ultimately the Bible doesn't try to give us a theory of atonement. It
Mhm.
gives us a picture of God giving his son and his son suffering this public, brutal death, hanging there and I mean, completely naked, not like in the pictures,
Right.
skin ripped off of him, bleeding, and that is how much God loved us. And in whatever all the arguments to me, they get put to rest in that beautiful picture that God
Mhm.
gave his son to us. He's giving us, it's almost like it's a sacrifice towards us. Normally we sacrifice towards God, but here's
Mhm.
God giving his son in our direction.
Right.
And that's, I mean, that for millennia has been such a powerful image that theologians can debate all about it all they want, but there's been people who are just so overpowered by that image that they can't explain.
Mhm.
And I mean, that to me
Yeah.
is just powerful. That's when I
Oh,
think
yeah.
of Passover, that's what I think of, is
Mhm.
that powerful image
Yes, I
of
agree.
giving
Because
love.
then you brought up the fact that it has to mean something, but it has to be something that God wants, right? I mean, we can't just sacrifice anything we choose. It has to be his desire to have that. But just like I think of when we worship, again, going back to Leviticus, you had Aaron's son decide how they were going to worship God and were burned up for it, pretty much killed for it, because they came in to the temple deciding, I will give this fire. The Bible calls it strange fire, but it's more or less, we every single day of our lives, we want to worship God in our own way. We want to worship God like this and like that, and God has it laid out how he wants to be worshiped. But when we take it upon ourselves, then it's not really a sacrifice of anything. It's not true worship when we're doing something for him. And he gave his most precious gift, which was his son. So it meant something to him. And it
Yeah.
has to mean something to him, just like it meant something like to us as well. So if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So yeah, we've had a good conversation, but that went quickly. So I'm amazed how fast it, no matter how I try to stick around 45 minutes, the conversation is always so good that it's hard to stick in there. But thank you. And I appreciate you being here and sharing your knowledge and your wisdom. And just so people know, it's at faithinmessiah.com is your
Faith
website.
of, yeah, faithofmessiah.com.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Faith of
It was
Messiah.
taken when I was looking for a URL to buy.
Okay. Oh no, I get that.
I do like that concept of, yeah, faith of Messiah. But yeah, there's a ton of resources on there. What I'm working now is I'm converting a lot of the videos into written articles,
Okay.
but all the videos are there. There, if you're there's a there's a lot of free stuff, but if people are interested, there's a membership that gives you access to like 400 hours of videos, which is overwhelming. And
Yeah.
so what I've done is I've invested in this like amazing platform that transcribes every single video. So if you're interested in the Passover, you can type in the word Passover and it will pull up not just every video that mentions Passover, but it will show you it'll give you the link to the exact point in time in the video where Passover is mentioned. So that's super cool. It
Yeah.
also, if you're into AI, and I know some people aren't, but it has its own like little AI bot that's only trained on my transcripts of my videos. So you can ask me a question and it's going to use only my information. I've tested this. I've asked it stuff that I know I didn't teach on, and it'll say, I don't know.
Oh,
It'll actually like give you like a full like as if I was responding using all of my information. So
wow.
that's super cool. If you're not up for a membership though, there is a newsletter sign up it uses kind of that same platform, but it's free. You get a newsletter and you get to watch the weekly Torah portion and what I like to call the gospel cycle.
Mm-hmm.
I took the gospels plus Acts, broke it into 52 weeks,
Okay.
and doing a video for each week. So that's completely free.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah, and I know I need to get a link up on my website to sign up for that. I have a link out there on Facebook I never put on the website, but I'll have that up by the time this is posted.
that's
Uh,
fine.
the other thing I'd really like if you're someone who is just sick of like the toxic environment on social media where Facebook, you post something and there's always someone there who wants to argue and debate and tear you down. We've created it's a platform kind of similar to Facebook. It has kind of the same idea of posting things, and we do monthly webinars on there as well. It's called Saturday Church Community. It
Okay.
is a very small membership, $2 a month, that helps us support the platform because it does have a cost to me with that. But it's just a place where it's not like we want you to come in with curiosity. It's about if you're excited for something, like we want you to have a safe space to ask a question without fear of everyone ripping you apart saying that you're a heretic.
Right.
Like every question is welcome in there, and and so that's kind of part of the fee with that too. Is if you turn into a jerk, we're going to kick you out, and if
Mhm.
you want to keep coming back, we'll take your $2 and I'll keep kicking you out. But it's a
Yeah.
very that was there was so many times I meet with people and they say, I see your posts, I want to comment on them, but there's always someone who's like tearing me down and they're such a jerk about things. And I said, you know what, we need to have a place
Yeah.
where people can just love God and love each other, and we
Mm.
can have discussions, but they have to be done in a friendly manner. So that's what
That's
that site's
awesome.
all about.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you have webinars on there too, I saw, right?
Yeah,
So
we discuss some controversial things like women in the Bible, apparently.
I know. I know. I saw
I
that.
couldn't believe that one. That one blew up on when
Wow.
my advertisement blew up, but obviously anyone inside of that space is not going to be able to say some of those things. So
Yeah. Well, I wanted to hear that one, and I know you had one on pagan stuff.
yeah,
So, so yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I will put all these links on my show notes and people can check you out. So thank you very much.
awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me on.